luxury. Her parents had taught her that kindness was the greatest treasure a person could give to the world, and she carried that belief in her heart. When other children dreamed of becoming rich or famous, Maria dreamed of helping others, especially those who could not help themselves. That dream had guided her into the quiet, often unnoticed world of caregiving. She worked at a nursing home that was far from glamorous. The walls were painted in pale colors, the halls echoed with the slow steps of nurses, and the smell of medicine mixed with the faint scent of flowers that families brought for their loved ones. Most people who came to visit stayed for a short time, offering hurried smiles before leaving again. For Maria, however, the nursing home was more than a workplace. It was a place filled with stories, memories, and souls who needed warmth in the final chapters of their lives. Among all the patients, there was one man who had captured Maria's heart in a special way. His name was Mr. Thompson. He was an elderly man, well into his 80s, with silver hair that rested gently against his pillow. His eyes, once sharp and full of energy, often seemed distant, as though they wandered between the present and memories only he could see. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often a few quiet words that faded into silence. Many of the staff considered him difficult because he did not respond much, and they assumed he did not notice the world around him anymore. But Maria thought differently. She believed that even silence carried feelings. She would notice how his eyes softened when someone spoke kindly to him, or how his hands relaxed when touched with care. She believed that deep inside, he was listening, even if his voice no longer joined the conversation. And so, she made it her mission to bring comfort to him, not only through medicine and routine, but through the kind of care that spoke to the heart. Maria's days began early. She would walk to the nursing home while the streets were still quiet, carrying her simple lunch in a small bag. She never complained about the long hours or the little pay. For her, every morning was a chance to make someone's day brighter. She would greet each resident with a smile, no matter how tired she felt. Some responded with cheerful words, some with shy nods, and some, like Mr. Thompson, with silence. But silence never discouraged her. There was something about Mr. Thompson that reminded Maria of her grandfather, who had passed away years before. She remembered how her grandfather used to sit by the window, looking out at the world in silence, and how a gentle song or story would bring life back to his face. Perhaps that memory was why Maria often found herself drawn to Mr. Thompson's side. She would adjust his blanket, bring him tea, and sometimes, when the room was very quiet, she would hum a soft tune. Her voice was not trained, but it was gentle, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. She sang songs her mother once sang to her at bedtime, simple lullabies that carried warmth without needing many words. At first, she wasn't sure if Mr. Thompson noticed. But one evening, when she paused, she saw the faintest smile touch his lips, as if a hidden part of him had been awakened by the sound. That smile was enough to encourage her to keep singing. Other staff sometimes teased her, saying she wasted time by singing to someone who might not even understand. But Maria never paid attention to their words. She believed that love and care were never wasted. Even if Mr. Thompson could not speak or thank her, she knew that her presence made a difference. Sometimes, when she held his hand, she felt a gentle squeeze in return, and it reminded her that no act of kindness was too small. Outside the nursing home, Maria's life was simple. She lived in a small apartment, shared with a cousin to save on rent. She cooked her own meals, often simple rice and vegetables, and spent her free time reading or writing in a small journal. She had dreams, of course, dreams of becoming a nurse, of helping people in a bigger way, but those dreams always felt distant, buried under the weight of her responsibilities. Still, she never allowed bitterness to grow in her heart. She often told herself that even if she could not change the whole world, she could at least change the world for one person. And for now, that person was Mr. Thompson. On quiet evenings, when the halls of the nursing home grew dim and the voices faded, Maria would often find herself sitting beside Mr. Thompson's bed. She would adjust his pillow, whisper comforting words, and sometimes tell him about her day. She told him about the weather outside, about a child she saw playing in the park on her way to work, or about the bird that always perched on the nursing home window in the morning. She spoke as though he were listening, and deep down, she believed he was. It was during those evenings that she felt a sense of peace she couldn't explain. The world outside might have been full of noise, of people rushing for wealth and success, but in that quiet room, everything slowed down. It was just her and an old man who needed comfort, and for Maria, that was enough. Little did she know that these simple acts of kindness, these soft songs, these quiet talks were weaving a story that would soon change her own life in ways she could never imagine. At that moment, she was only a caregiver, doing her duty with love. She never sought praise, never expected reward, and never thought anyone important was watching. To her, kindness was something given freely, not in hopes of recognition. And so, as she sat by Mr. Thompson's side, humming softly, she believed the world outside did not notice. But the world had its own way of bringing surprises. Unseen by her, the seeds she planted with her compassion were already growing, waiting for the right moment to bloom. That evening was like many others in the nursing home. The halls had quieted down, most residents had been given their evening medicine, and the staff moved softly from room to room, making sure everyone was settled. Maria finished checking on a few patients before walking slowly to Mr. Thompson's room. She carried a glass of water in one hand and a small notebook in the other. She often wrote little reminders about his needs, because she wanted to be certain she never forgot even the smallest detail about his care. When she entered his room, she found him awake, his eyes staring at the ceiling with a troubled expression. His thin hands gripped the blanket tightly, as if he were fighting something only he could feel. Maria's heart sank. She knew that sometimes elderly patients became restless at night, and no amount of medicine could fully ease the unease that came with age, memories, or loneliness. She placed the glass of water on the bedside table and gently touched his shoulder. "It's okay, Mr. Thompson. You're safe," she whispered softly. His eyes shifted slowly toward her, and though he did not speak, she felt the weight of his silence. She pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down, folding her hands in her lap for a moment. She could have left after giving him his medicine, but something inside her refused to walk away. She remembered how her own grandfather sometimes struggled at night, and how just sitting by his side made him calmer. So, she decided to stay. Maria leaned closer, speaking in a gentle tone. She told him about the weather outside, how the sky had turned pink at sunset, and how the sound of children playing in the nearby street had reminded her of her own childhood. She did not know if he understood everything she said, but she believed that the sound of her voice might bring him comfort. After a few minutes, she noticed his breathing was still uneven, and his eyes still carried a shadow of worry. That was when she remembered the lullabies her mother used to sing to her when she was a little girl. Without thinking too much, she began to hum softly. Her voice was quiet, not meant for performance, but filled with warmth. The melody flowed gently in the silent room. At first, it was only a hum, but then she added a few simple words. It was an old tune about peace and rest, one she had carried in her memory since childhood. Her voice wrapped around the silence like a blanket, soft and reassuring. She held his hand while she sang. His skin was fragile, his veins visible beneath the pale surface, yet when she touched him, he seemed to relax slightly. His grip on the blanket loosened, and slowly, his eyes began to close. For the first time in days, he looked calm, as though her voice had carried him away from his worries into a place of quiet. Maria felt tears sting her eyes, though she didn't know why. Perhaps it was because she realized how powerful a simple act of kindness could be. She wasn't giving him medicine, she wasn't performing any grand act, she was simply singing, yet it brought more peace than anything else had. She lowered her voice as the song went on, until it became almost like a whisper, blending with the rhythm of his breathing. Finally, he drifted into sleep. His face, once tight with discomfort, softened into peace. Maria smiled, her heart swelling with relief. She stayed by his side for a little longer, watching him rest. She thought of how lonely he must feel at times, and she promised herself that she would never let him feel forgotten. What Maria didn't realize was that she wasn't alone in that moment. In the quiet hallway just outside the room, a tall man stood silently, his hand resting on the doorframe. He had arrived only minutes earlier, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted with the homely atmosphere of the nursing home. His expression carried a mix of guilt and sadness as he watched the scene unfolding before him. The man was Richard, Mr. Thompson's only son. He had come that evening to check on his father, though visits from him were rare. His life had been consumed by business meetings, travel, and the endless chase for success. Years had slipped by in the pursuit of wealth, and though he provided for his father financially, he had not been present in the ways that truly mattered. When he walked down the hallway earlier, he expected to find his father asleep, perhaps cared for by a nurse quickly doing her duties before moving on. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. He saw a young woman sitting by his father's bed, holding his hand, singing to him with a tenderness that pierced straight through his chest. For a long time, he simply watched. He had seen many people work for his father: doctors, nurses, attendants, but never had he seen anyone treat him with such warmth. It was not duty in her eyes, nor obligation, it was genuine care. Richard felt a heaviness grow in his heart. This stranger was giving his father the kind of love and comfort that he himself had failed to give for years. He leaned against the wall, listening to her voice, watching how his father's face changed from restlessness to calm. It struck him more deeply than any speech or lecture could. Here was a young woman with little in terms of wealth or power, yet she possessed something he lacked, the ability to give without expecting anything in return. When Maria finally stopped singing and remained quietly by his father's side, Richard stepped back, not wanting her to notice him. He left the hallway as silently as he had come, his mind filled with thoughts that refused to leave. That night, as he drove back to his large, empty house, he kept seeing her face, hearing her voice, and replaying the image of his father finally sleeping in peace. Maria, unaware of all this, eventually stood up, adjusted Mr. Thompson's blanket, and whispered, "Good night." She turned off the lamp, leaving only the dim light from the hallway, and left the room quietly. For her, it was just another evening of doing what felt right. She had no idea that her small act of kindness had been witnessed, and that it was about to set in motion changes she could never have imagined. The nursing home grew silent as she walked back to the staff room, but inside, Maria carried a quiet joy. She had given peace to someone who needed it. To her, that was reward enough. And yet, without her knowing, someone with the power to transform her life had just seen her true heart, and nothing would ever be the same again. The following morning began like any other for Maria. She tied her hair into a neat bun, packed her simple lunch of bread and boiled eggs, and walked briskly to the nursing home. The streets were already alive with people rushing to work, vendors calling out to sell fruit, and children hurrying to school. For Maria, it was just another ordinary day. She had no idea that the night before, someone had silently witnessed the kindness she had offered Mr. Thompson. When she arrived at the nursing home, she greeted the other staff with her usual smile. Some responded warmly, others with the tired nod of people used to long hours of work. Maria didn't mind. She had always believed that a smile could lighten the weight of a heavy day, even if only a little. She quickly put on her uniform and began her rounds, checking on the residents one by one. Mr. Thompson was still asleep when she entered his room. His breathing was steady, his face relaxed. Seeing him like that brought a wave of relief to Maria. She remembered how restless he had been the night before and how singing to him had seemed to help. She gently adjusted the curtains to let in a soft stream of morning light and whispered, "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I'll come back later when you're awake." She placed a fresh glass of water by his bed and quietly left. What Maria didn't know was that Richard, Mr. Thompson's son, had spent the night thinking about her. When he returned home after witnessing her kindness, he found himself unable to focus on anything else. He sat in his luxurious living room, surrounded by expensive furniture, yet he felt strangely empty. For years, he had believed that success meant wealth, property, and recognition. He had all of that, yet watching a young woman singing to his father had made him realize how much he lacked in the simplest but most important ways. He thought about his father, lying in that quiet room. He remembered the strong man who had once raised him, who had guided him through childhood. Yet in recent years, he had visited only on holidays or birthdays, always in a hurry, always distracted. He had told himself that providing money for his father's care was enough. But now, seeing a stranger show his father more tenderness than he himself had given, Richard felt a sharp sting of guilt. The next day, Richard decided to visit the nursing home again. Unlike his usual quick visits, this time he wanted to stay longer. He dressed in a more casual shirt, leaving his expensive suit behind, hoping to blend in more with the quiet atmosphere. When he arrived, the staff greeted him politely, recognizing him as Mr. Thompson's son. They assumed he was there for another brief check-in, but Richard had something else in mind. He walked down the familiar hallway until he reached his father's room. To his surprise, he found Maria already there, helping Mr. Thompson sit up in bed. She was speaking to him softly, offering him tea, and adjusting his pillow with gentle care. Richard stood silently at the door for a moment, watching. There was nothing extraordinary in her actions, no grand gestures, no dramatic words, yet the sincerity behind every movement was undeniable. Finally, Richard stepped into the room. Maria looked up quickly, startled by his sudden presence. She had seen him before during one of his rare visits, though she had never spoken to him directly. She recognized him as the wealthy son, the man who always came in a rush, barely staying for a few minutes before leaving again. "Good morning," Richard said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of politeness and uncertainty. Maria stood up, slightly nervous. "Good morning, sir. Your father is doing well today. He seems more rested than yesterday." Richard glanced at his father, who looked calmer than usual. He then turned his gaze back to Maria. "I was here last night," he admitted. "I saw you with him." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Had she overstepped her duty by staying too long in his room? Had she broken some rule by singing to him? Her mind filled with worry as she tried to explain. "I'm sorry if I disturbed him. He couldn't sleep, so I just sang a little, hoping it might help. I didn't mean to overstep." Richard raised his hand slightly, stopping her. "No, you didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you did more than I ever expected." His voice softened, carrying a hint of something deeper, something Maria hadn't expected to hear. "I watched how you cared for him. You weren't just doing your job. You were giving him something I failed to give him for years: comfort, warmth, love." Maria felt her cheeks warm. She wasn't used to such words, especially from someone like Richard. She lowered her eyes, unsure of how to respond. "I only did what anyone would do," she said quietly. "He reminds me of my grandfather. I just want him to feel that he isn't alone." Richard studied her for a moment, noticing the honesty in her words. There was no pride in her tone, no attempt to impress. It was simple truth, spoken from the heart. He realized that her kindness was not for recognition or reward, it was simply who she was. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound being Mr. Thompson's slow breathing. Richard finally spoke again. "You've opened my eyes," he said quietly. I thought providing money was enough. But last night, I realized I've been absent in ways that matter most. Watching you with him, it made me see how much I failed as a son." Maria lifted her gaze slightly, her eyes soft with empathy. "It's never too late," she said gently. "He may not speak much, but he feels more than we realize. Sometimes just sitting beside him makes a difference." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He pulled a chair closer and sat down beside his father's bed. It was the first time in years he had sat with him without rushing, without looking at his watch. Maria quietly stepped back, giving them space, but Richard turned to her. "Please, stay. I think he rests better when you're here." So, for the first time, the three of them shared a quiet moment together. Maria hummed softly, Richard held his father's other hand, and Mr. Thompson, though silent, seemed surrounded by a sense of peace. As the minutes passed, Richard realized something he had never felt before. His wealth, his power, his success, none of it compared to this simple moment of connection. And the person who had shown him this truth was not another businessman, not a mentor, not a lecture from a book. It was a young caregiver who earned little, yet gave more than he could ever imagine. That evening, as Richard left the nursing home, he carried a decision in his heart. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew one thing for certain: Maria's kindness had changed something inside him, and he could no longer go back to the way things were before. The following days brought a change in the atmosphere around Mr. Thompson's room. For years, the old man had been surrounded only by hurried visits, brief check-ins, and quiet silence. Now, things began to feel different. Richard started visiting more often, sometimes sitting for hours by his father's bedside. At first, he wasn't sure what to say. His conversations were awkward, filled with pauses, as if the words he had locked away for years didn't know how to find their way out. But Maria was always there to guide the silence into something meaningful. She would talk about small things: the birds that perched on the windowsill, the smell of fresh flowers in the hallway, or the sound of rain tapping against the glass when clouds rolled over the city. Her voice filled the room with life, and Richard found himself listening more than he spoke. It was strange for him, a man used to dominating boardrooms with his sharp voice, to sit quietly and simply listen. But in Maria's presence, it felt natural. One afternoon, Richard arrived earlier than usual. He found Maria reading softly to Mr. Thompson from an old storybook she had borrowed from the nursing home's small library. Her voice was gentle, carrying each word with patience, as if every sentence mattered. Richard leaned against the door for a moment before stepping inside. "You always seem to know what he needs," Richard said quietly. Maria looked up, a little surprised, but smiled. "Stories calm him. Even if he doesn't reply, I think he enjoys listening. Words can be like company when someone feels lonely." Richard nodded and pulled a chair closer. "I used to forget that. I was always too busy." There was no judgment in Maria's eyes. She didn't lecture him or make him feel small. She simply said, "We all get busy. What matters is that you're here now." Those words sank deep into Richard's heart. He thought about all the years he had missed: birthdays spent away, holidays skipped because of work, evenings where his father sat alone in the nursing home while he attended expensive dinners with strangers. For the first time in years, Richard felt the sharp weight of regret pressing on his chest. Yet Maria's kindness gave him a sense of hope. Perhaps it wasn't too late to change. As the days passed, Richard began to open up more. Sometimes he would tell Maria about his business trips, about the cities he had visited, about the success he had chased so fiercely. But as he spoke, he realized that his stories sounded hollow. What once felt like achievements now seemed meaningless compared to the way Maria's face lit up when she described something as simple as a walk in the park or a shared laugh with another patient. One evening, when Mr. Thompson had already fallen asleep, Richard asked Maria to sit with him for a while. They moved to a small bench outside the nursing home, where the night air was cool and the sky was scattered with stars. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Richard said, almost in a whisper, "I've been thinking a lot about what I saw that night. The way you sang to my father. It made me realize something about myself that I didn't want to admit." Maria turned to him, listening carefully. "I thought being a good son meant paying the bills, making sure he had the best care, the best doctors, the most comfortable place to stay. I thought money covered everything. But I was wrong. What he needed was time, attention, someone to hold his hand and remind him he isn't forgotten." Richard's voice broke slightly as he spoke. "And the truth is, I wasn't there for him. I failed him." Maria's heart softened at his words. She saw not a proud millionaire but a man weighed down by his own mistakes. She placed her hand gently on his arm. "You're here now. That matters more than you realize. Love doesn't count the years you missed. Sometimes, even a single moment of truth can mean more than all the days before." Her words comforted him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Richard felt understood, not as a wealthy businessman, but as a son who longed to make things right. From that evening on, Richard tried harder. He visited his father daily, sometimes reading to him, sometimes sitting in silence, and sometimes just listening to Maria sing softly while holding his father's hand. Slowly, the bond that had been broken by years of absence began to mend, not only between father and son, but also between Richard and his own heart. Yet, as much as Richard grew closer to his father, he found himself thinking more and more about Maria. There was something extraordinary about her simplicity. She had no riches, no fame, no powerful position, yet she carried a strength that moved him more than anything he had ever achieved in his career. He admired how she gave her whole heart to her work, how she treated every resident as if they were family, and how she found joy in the smallest acts of kindness. One afternoon, Richard asked Maria if she could spare a moment to talk privately. She looked uncertain but agreed. They sat in the small staff lounge, where the air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. Richard seemed nervous, which surprised her. He was a man who owned businesses and spoke confidently in front of crowds, yet here, in front of her, his words stumbled at first. "I wanted to thank you," he began. "Not just for what you do for my father, but for what you've shown me. Watching you has changed me in ways I can't fully explain. I used to think kindness was a weakness. Now I see it's the greatest strength." Maria lowered her gaze, shy but touched by his sincerity. "I'm just doing my job," she said softly. "No," Richard replied firmly. "You're doing more than a job. You're giving people dignity, love, and hope. That's not something money can buy." There was silence between them for a moment, filled only by the hum of the vending machine in the corner. Maria didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to being praised like this. To her, caring for others was simply natural. It wasn't something she thought deserved special recognition. Richard leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You've made me realize what truly matters in life. And I can't ignore that anymore." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Maria felt the weight of his gaze, not as a wealthy man looking at someone beneath him, but as one human being seeing another. Maria's heart beat a little faster, though she quickly looked away. She wasn't sure what he meant by his words, but she sensed that something was changing in him, something deep and genuine. That night, Maria went home thoughtful. She remembered Richard's words, the way his voice had carried both regret and hope. She wondered what it must be like to live with so much wealth yet feel so incomplete. She wondered why fate had allowed her simple lullaby to reach his heart. Meanwhile, Richard lay awake in his large home, unable to sleep. He thought of Maria, of her soft voice, of the way she had gently reminded him that it wasn't too late to be a better son. He thought of her hands holding his father's, of her smile when she spoke of small joys. And in his heart, he knew with certainty, his life would never be the same again. The weeks that followed seemed to move gently, as if time itself slowed down around Mr. Thompson's room. The once distant father now had his son beside him more often, and Maria continued to care for him with the same tenderness she had always shown. The quiet lullabies, the stories she read aloud, and the small conversations about everyday life filled the room with warmth. Richard had changed. The man who once lived in boardrooms and airports began finding excuses to spend more time at the nursing home. At first, the staff were surprised to see him appear so often, but soon it became normal. He no longer arrived with hurried steps and restless eyes. Instead, he carried a softer presence, as though something inside him had finally begun to heal. Maria noticed the change, too. She watched how he now reached for his father's hand without hesitation, how he leaned closer to speak even if his father did not respond, and how his voice carried patience instead of urgency. Sometimes she caught him watching her as she worked, not with the sharp, calculating look of a businessman, but with quiet gratitude. She didn't know what to make of it, so she simply continued her duties as she always had, never expecting anything more than the joy of helping others. One evening, after Mr. Thompson had been settled into bed, Richard asked Maria once again to join him outside on the small bench by the garden. The air smelled faintly of flowers, and the stars blinked softly above them. Richard sat quietly for a moment, his hands folded together, before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about life," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I spent years chasing wealth, power, and recognition. I thought those things would make me happy, but they only left me empty. And then I saw you, sitting with my father, singing to him as if he were your own family. That night, something inside me changed." Maria listened silently, her heart softening at his words. "You've given me a gift," Richard continued. "You reminded me of what truly matters: love, kindness, presence. You gave my father peace, and you gave me the chance to see him not just as an old man in a bed, but as the father I still have time to love." He turned his head toward her, his eyes earnest. "I don't think I can ever thank you enough for that." Maria shook her head gently. "You don't need to thank me. Caring for him is my duty, but it's also my joy. He deserves dignity, respect, and love just like anyone else. If I could give him even a little comfort, then that's all the reward I need." Her humility touched Richard more deeply than he could express. Here was a young woman who had so little in material wealth, yet she carried more richness in her heart than he had ever found in all his success. A few days later, Richard returned to the nursing home with an unusual request. He asked Maria if she could meet him in the director's office. Nervous, she agreed, unsure of what was happening. When she entered the room, she found Richard standing beside the director, holding a folder of documents. Richard turned to her with a smile. "Maria, I know you've never asked for anything, but I cannot ignore what you've done. You changed my father's final years. You changed me. And I want to change your life in return." Maria looked confused. "I don't understand," the director smiled kindly. "Richard has arranged something very special for you." Richard opened the folder and placed a set of papers on the desk. "You once mentioned you dreamed of becoming a nurse, but that it felt impossible because of money. Well, I want to make sure nothing stands in your way. I've set up a scholarship for you. Your education, your training, everything will be covered. You won't have to worry about expenses. You can finally chase the dream you put aside." Maria's eyes widened, tears filling them before she could stop herself. I don't know what to say." "This is too much," Richard shook his head firmly. "It isn't too much. It's the least I can do. You gave my father comfort when I could not. You gave me a second chance as a son. If anyone deserves to live their dream, it's you." For a moment, Maria couldn't speak. She had spent years working quietly, never expecting recognition, never dreaming that her small acts of kindness would be noticed. And now here she was, standing in a room where her life was being changed forever because of the very things she had once thought went unseen. Finally, through her tears, she whispered, "Thank you. I'll never forget this." Richard smiled, his heart light. "No, Maria. It's me who will never forget you." From that day forward, Maria's life took a new turn. She continued working at the nursing home for a while, but with the scholarship in place, she began preparing for her studies. The other staff admired her, inspired by how her dedication and kindness had brought her such an opportunity. Many residents who had grown fond of her celebrated the news, their faces lighting up with joy as she shared her plans. Richard, too, remained present. He didn't disappear back into his busy life. Instead, he became more involved, not only in his father's care but in the lives of other residents. He funded improvements for the nursing home, adding more comfortable rooms, a small garden for patients to enjoy, and better facilities for the staff. All of it, he said, was inspired by Maria. As for Maria, she studied hard, determined not to waste the chance she had been given. Each lesson reminded her of why she started this journey to help those who could not help themselves, to give dignity and comfort where it was most needed. Every step she took was filled with gratitude for the moment she had sung softly to an old man, never realizing someone was watching. Years later, Maria stood proudly as a nurse, her white uniform crisp and clean. She carried the same heart she always had, the same gentle voice, the same compassion, the same belief that kindness could change lives. And indeed, it had changed hers. When people asked her how she reached where she was, she would smile and tell them, "It started with a song. A song I sang to a man who needed comfort. I thought no one was listening, but someone was. And that moment changed everything." For Richard, his life had also transformed. He had discovered that wealth was not in numbers or possessions, but in the love and connections we build with others. He had regained a bond with his father and found inspiration in a caregiver who reminded him of what truly mattered. And for Mr. Thompson, though his days eventually grew fewer, his final years were filled with peace. He was surrounded not by silence, but by voices that cared, by hands that held him, and by hearts that loved him. In the end, that was all he ever needed. The story of Maria, the caregiver who sang softly, became more than just a memory in Richard's mind. It became a living reminder that even the smallest acts of love can leave the greatest marks, and that sometimes, the simplest kindness can open doors to miracles we never imagined.